from Chrissy. During the Passover festival, Jesus went to Jerusalem. Having taught his version of Judaism in the small towns and villages, he decided to appear in the capital city. It was a risky venture, for he was already under suspicion. Now, according to the story, Jesus entered the city, and people took off their coats, or they cut leafy branches from the fields. The word palm doesn't appear until the Gospel of John. The first three Gospels refer to leafy branches. So this is really Leafy Branches Sunday. They spread their coats and the leafy branches on the road before him as he rode to the Jewish temple in the heart of the city. Now, this attention, all these people praising him and putting down branches and their coats, it gave Jesus a false sense of confidence in his power as a religious leader. He went to the temple and he began to chase out the vendors and the shoppers. He overturned the tables of the bankers along with the chairs of the pigeon merchants. He said something like this: "Don't the scriptures say my house is to be regarded as a house of prayer for all people? But you've turned it into a hideout for crooks." Well, because he was a riotous and disruptive Jew, a few days after arriving in Jerusalem, the Romans arrested him and executed him. I believe that on Palm Sunday, when Jesus entered Jerusalem, he was committed to reforming Judaism. He thought he had enough support to make the changes he wanted to make. I don't think he expected the Romans to arrest him and execute him. Still, he must have known that what he was doing was dangerous. Jesus loved his approach to Judaism so much that he was willing to take the risk. The act of sacrificial love is a basic thrust for most human beings. It's not just Jesus who took the risk out of love. Many of us have done so. An extreme example occurred on a Sunday morning in July 2008 at the Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist Church in Knoxville. An unemployed truck driver who hated liberals, Democrats, African Americans, and homosexuals, he entered a church and opened fire on the members of the congregation. 60-year-old Greg McKendry was a longtime church member, and he was an usher, and he deliberately stood in front of the gunman to protect the others in the Unitarian Universalist Church. He gave his life for others by slowing the shooter's access to the congregation. Now, most of the time, our sacrifices are less extreme. And this time of year, early April, I think of a friend who sacrificed his career because of his love for the city where he lived all his life. Now, this man, he loved his wife, he loved his children, he loved the Unitarian Church of Evanston where he was a member, but he really loved the city of Chicago. So on a Sunday, April 5th, 1992, after I'd given my sermon at the Evanston Unitarian Church, on my way back to my office, I stopped in the church lounge to say hello to John LaPlante. His wife, Linda LaPlante, was the church administrator. John would often sit in the lounge next to her office and do his work while waiting for Linda to finish her church work so they could go home. I was the church's senior minister. And that Sunday in April, 31 years ago, I asked John, "How are things going in your job?" Now, he held the title of Acting Transportation Commissioner for several months, Acting Transportation Commissioner in the city of Chicago. He had risen through the ranks after starting to work for the city of Chicago in 1960. Chicago's new mayor, Richard M. Daley, son of Mayor Richard J. Daley, was taking a long time deciding who he was going to appoint as the Commissioner of Transportation. John was the acting commissioner. If he selected John, he would be choosing a man with a master's degree in civil engineering from Northwestern University and 32 years of experience dealing with city transportation issues. On the other hand, John had no political constituency that he could use to help the mayor win re-election, except for bike riders. John was a staunch supporter of bike paths in the city of Chicago. But sadly, bike path supporters do not represent a large voting bloc. That day, Sunday, April 5th, I asked John how he was doing. He was patiently waiting to hear from the mayor one way or another. And I wished him luck and went on to my office. John returned to the paperwork that he had brought from his office, paperwork he was working on from his job while Linda finished her work. 8 days later, Monday, April 13th, was my day off. It was the day after Palm Sunday. I was home taking care of my daughter while my wife was at work. After 11 in the morning, about 11 in the morning, I turned on the TV looking for Sesame Street. Instead, I heard the words, "Continuing our special report on the flooding in downtown Chicago, Commonwealth Edison has cut all electric power to the downtown area because underground substations are flooded. All trading of commodity futures have been stopped because the basement of the Board of Trade is flooded. The Sears Tower is closed. The basement of City Hall, containing vital records of the city, is flooded. All retail stores, including Marshall Field's, have been closed. The State Street subway is closed. Mayor Daley has ordered an evacuation of 1 million people from downtown Chicago. Here at the TV station, we are operating on emergency generators, and they tell us we must evacuate the building." Flooding? I looked outside the window. The sun was shining. It hadn't rained in days. What was this about flooding? Well, under downtown Chicago was a vast network of tunnels dug around 1900 to be used for coal and mail delivery to buildings in the central city. The system had not been used since 1959, but the tunnel still ran under the city and into many buildings. One, which ran under the Chicago River, had a hole in it. Water was rushing into the basements of many buildings. At 10 p.m. that Monday night of Easter week, Mayor Daley appeared at a news conference. He promised he would deliver the heads of any city employees linked to the trouble. Tuesday morning, April 14th, we had our usual staff meeting at the church. I asked Linda LaPlante, the church administrator, if Daley might pick her husband to blame for the flooding. "It's possible," she said. "It's possible." We haven't talked much. John got a call at 6 a.m. Monday. I heard him say, "Tell them we're working on it." In a few minutes, he dressed and left. He came home at 1 a.m. Tuesday morning and then left again at 5:30 a.m. At 2:15 Tuesday afternoon, I was in my car driving from a hospital visit to the library to research a sermon. All the Chicago TV and radio stations broadcast a statement by Mayor Daley. He explained that in January, a man from the cable TV company had started trying to tell a tunnel inspector at the Department of General Services about the tunnel break. The cable TV company ran its wires through the tunnels, and they observed that there was a problem under the river in January. Then Daley said, April 2nd, the chief bridge engineer sent a memo to John LaPlante stating that unless the city repaired the tunnel wall immediately, the city faced the danger of flooding out the entire freight tunnel system. The problem was brought to Mr. LaPlante's attention, but he failed to act, resulting in a major problem that could have been avoided. This was not a minor oversight. The cost to the city, the business community, and the people of Chicago will be enormous. I have asked for and received John LaPlante's resignation. Well, I turned my car away from the library and I headed back to church. Linda was on the phone talking to John when I arrived. After 32 years of working for the city, he was to clear out his desk for personal things. A city employee would escort him out of the building and drive him home, and he expected to get there in a few hours. I told Linda to take as many days off as she needed. Two church members, longtime friends, spent that evening with John and Linda. That night I called and talked to John briefly. He was on the phone with a reporter when I called. The next day, Wednesday, April 15th, John's name and picture were the lead stories on all the network TV newscasts. I watched his picture on the BBC News out of London. Reporters said that because he did not order a $55,000 repair, the flood had caused $1.5 billion in damages. The text of the letter of resignation read in part, quote, I accept full responsibility for the failure of our department to make a timely repair to the Kinzie Street freight tunnel, end quote. Mid-morning, I called John and talked to him briefly. He said, Roger, it felt good last night when I got off the line with you to be able to say to the reporter, that was my minister. Thursday, April 16th, the host of the Public Affairs program interviewed John on television. In response to a question, John admitted, I get 100 to 200 memos a day. When I got the memo about the tunnel leak, which arrived in the regular inner office mail Friday, April 3rd, I took it home, along with the rest of the mail that I had not yet read. I read the memo while I was at church on April 5th, waiting for my wife. And I wrote a memo back saying, proceed as soon as possible. Proceed ASAP. Isn't it a fact, said the interviewer, that your department was not responsible for the tunnels? Isn't it a fact that the mayor ordered a reorganization last October 15th, and that on January 1st, following the mayor's plan, responsibility for the tunnels was transferred to the Department of General Services? Well, when offered this opportunity to blame the Department of General Services, John said, when there is an emergency, I don't believe I should fall back on the formality of asking which department on paper is responsible. Everyone should do what needs to be done. My job, as I saw it, was, if there is a problem, fix it, and worry about who is going to pay for it and whose job it really is later. The interviewer asked John what it was like for him personally. It's hard to sleep, he said. This is something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. I'm not sure what I could have done differently. If there was anything I could have done differently, I certainly wish I had. I just don't know how to know these things in advance that everybody knows so clearly now in hindsight. Finally, the reporter asked him if he had any feelings about Mayor Daley. John said, "I still support the mayor. He is doing what he needs to do to solve a very difficult problem. I would not want to do anything that would harm the city of Chicago or the operation of the city. It was my job to take the heat." This is sacrificial love. I would not want to do anything that would harm the city of Chicago or the operation of the city. Monday, April 20th, the workers finally plugged the hole. The water started to go down. After a week, when the entire downtown of one of the largest cities in the United States had been closed, life gradually began to return to normal. Within 3 weeks of the flood, most stores and buildings reopened and were back in business. No one was injured. Now, back in 1992, Linda LaPlante and I agreed that there should be a made-for-TV movie about the flood, and we began casting parts. We decided Paul Newman should play John. Linda said she wanted Candice Bergman to play her role as John's wife. I suggested Danny DeVito as the Chicago mayor. And I also suggested that there be a cameo appearance by Robert Redford in the role of John's minister. Eventually, John went back to work, serving as vice president and chief traffic officer for an engineering firm. And after retirement, he and his partner Linda took trips. When I lived in Sarasota, they would come to visit me during the winter, and we would go to spring training baseball games. Sadly, John made the news one more time. 3 years ago, in February 2020, John and Linda took a trip to Egypt and to Jordan. When they returned in early March 3 years ago, John started to feel ill. Doctors placed him in isolation in the hospital. They did not allow anyone to go in and see him, not his family, not Linda, not his daughter. He had a new disease, an infectious disease. He died on March 21st, one of the first 500 persons in the United States to die of COVID-19. John was 80 years old. Now, when I look out on Unitarian Universalist congregations that I have served, I see parents who have sacrificed to care for a disabled child. I see husbands and wives who have sacrificed to care for a seriously ill partner. I see children who have sacrificed to care for their parents in a nursing home. I see friends who take the time to visit other friends in the hospital. I see a man who volunteers to visit people in prison. I see a doctor who volunteers in a free clinic. I see a retiree who volunteers as a tutor in a local school. I see a small business manager who kept a sick worker on salary even though she couldn't come to work so she would have health insurance. I see a counselor who provided therapy to a homeless person. I see political activists who unceasingly campaign for peace and justice. Adrian Rich wrote, My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. Like the Jewish man who entered Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, you are willing to take the risk to help your families, your community, your nation, your world. With no extraordinary power, you commit large and small acts of sacrificial love for others and for the things you believe in. On Palm Sunday, I honor and I celebrate your love. Let's sing our closing hymn.